Where is the cloud, someone may ask.
Yeah, well, it's the mystery of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
But plus we can edit the beginning out. Great. So now you can make me host again, Jonathan, and I'll start letting people in.
Oh, I haven't. Oh, I didn't realize that had changed then. So participants.
Yep.
Brilliant.
Okay. Well, Thomas. Well, hey, she's in. Hey, Michaela. How are you?
Hello.
Good, thank you. Hello, everyone.
Hi.
So we have a good dozen of people in the waiting room, which is always good.
Nice.
So we'll let them in. And then each one of us will have a couple of minutes to say why we feel strongly or not so strongly about this event. And then we'll just kick off. And with, key points of opinion when it comes to being more empathetic of others. Cool.
Sounds good. Thank you, Nikita.
And then we'll leave it for discussion. And then I might need to duck off. Brilliant. Oh, yes. Oh, hey, Jerry-Ann. How are you?
Hey, I'm good.
So, what made you volunteer for another Zoom meeting? I'm sure you have enough of them.
I don't have enough of them. I crave Zoom meetings.
Professional help, then, Jerry-Ann. We have a couple of therapists on the call that will be happy to help you with that.
Good to know.
But is there anything you'd like to explore about not personality? Sorry, that's muscle memory. Anything in particular you would like to explore about strong opinions and strong emotions?
Good question. I would love to know what can we do about it that is helpful.
Nice. What would be helpful if in your eyes?
I find that when people have strong emotions and strong feelings in the workplace, that they don't really listen to feedback about those. So how can you make yourself heard and seen without making the situation worse, I think.
Nice. So it's kind of like when you tell somebody they're being argumentative, their response is, no, I'm not. When you tell them they're being dramatic, they go, I'm not being dramatic. And so off in a huff.
Yeah, like I do with my kids when I shout at them to stop shouting kind of thing. It doesn't really work.
Well, the test retest on that and the criterion validity leaves a lot to be desired. Perfect. Thank you so much, Jerry-Ann. Anybody else cares to share with us what they would like to take away from today or what they would like to explore? In no particular order, Grant. Grant, are you there?
Hello, sorry, I'm having microphone issues. I'm on and off. Apologies if I made some background noise. I think strong emotions are just hard. They're just difficult to deal with, and people get scared by them. Or, you know, if there's someone who's comfortable expressing their strong emotions, we tend to kind of, what's the word? Like let them get away with it almost because we want to keep the peace. And so I'm interested in how, I suppose, we don't let strong emotions kind of win the day, even if they're pushing us towards something that's less of a logical solution.
Absolutely. So it all comes down to communication. Perfect. Well, talking about communication is a perfect time to introduce our wonderful speakers. So I'm very happy to say that we have 4 brilliant speakers joining us this morning. And what's going to happen is that each speaker will have 5 minutes to tell us who they are and how they feel about the strong emotions and polarized opinions and the key messages they want to communicate today. And after that should bring us up about past. And afterwards, it's going to be just a general discussion. Does that sound like a plan? I can see sort of a nod, 2 thumbs up from Jerry Ann, and as a psychologist, I'm going to say it's a representative sample of 20 people. So first and foremost, I would like to introduce Michaela Thomas. So I'm very happy that Michaela was able to join us, as I very respect her as a professional and a therapist, and also bringing a little bit more kindness and empathy into this world, both for ourselves and others. Michaela, what are your thoughts on the topic at hand?
Oh, I always hate going first. I'm Michaela Thomas. Thanks for that lovely introduction. I'm a clinical psychologist. So I obviously specialize in working with mental health difficulties, but also preventing mental health difficulties from arising as a wellbeing speaker and as a coach. And I work both in the corporate space, also with people one-to-one and in group coaching. So I've been seeing a lot of challenges since October. Really, the whole autumn has been filled with strong emotions. People have felt very much in the threat systems. So I wanted to talk a bit about that today, about how we can have compassion for those we don't like and how hard that is, and how we can have compassion for the times where we are really struggling with disagreements and polarized opinion from others. So I think just starting with saying to yourself, it's really, really hard at the moment for lots of people. December has been particularly hard already. So when our defenses are already kind of activated, when we're already feeling really depleted or tired, this has been an autumn of illness for lots of people. When we're already a little bit glass half empty because we're not very recharged, it's much harder to extend kindness, compassion, and empathy for other people. So we're more easily triggered, put it that way. So if you are someone who by nature is quite kind towards others and you want to be respectful, and then you kind of notice that other people maybe don't meet that, maybe they are more argumentative, maybe they are opinionated and you don't know what to do about it because you feel overwhelmed. Or on the polar opposite, maybe you are someone who is kind of quite strongly opinionated yourself, and then you don't know what to do about this when people are pushing back. So the key takeaway message for me is really to kind of give everyone a bit of a dollop of compassion for yourselves and for other people. So I wanted to start there by saying that it is possible to voice your opinion in a way that is kind, respectful, and assertive, that isn't about disagreeing with others, picking a fight, but equally also not going against your own self-respect. So I wanted to kind of help people think of 3 words, right? Passive, aggressive, and in the middle sits assertive. And I use this with couples that I work with in couples therapy, and I use this for compassionate communication. I specialize in perfectionism, and with that comes a lot of people pleasing. So you can imagine that when you are a people pleaser, trying to voice your opinion can be really hard, and you might feel really overrun by people who are good at being assertive. Often we don't see the assertiveness being so visible, we see the aggression being visible. So if you think of this almost like on a continuum, we're passive at one side, where you are submitting to the strong opinions of others, feel overrun by strong emotions from others, and you fold, putting other people's needs ahead of your own. On the other side, we have aggressive, where you are putting your needs ahead of other people's needs. That means that you are overrunning other people. That's not what we're talking about. We don't want someone who passively just accepts other people's opinions and squashes down their own. We don't want someone who aggressively puts their opinion onto others and doesn't respect that there's another perspective to the matter. What we want to do is meet somewhere in the middle. So assertive is not aggressive. Assertiveness can still be done kindly, respectfully, and with compassion. So I'm thinking of that as really important in the workplace. when someone is coming with a different perspective than your own, how can you kindly, respectfully hear that and maybe agree to disagree if you're coming from polar opposite sides, rather than saying, I need to then not speak up, I need to not say my own opinion, because that might leave you feeling really resentful. And what happens over time is we constantly stay in the passive and never voice our own opinion. We then ultimately, essentially, eventually fall into the aggressive and just explode and like, nobody ever listens to me. And that's where we can have very strong polarized emotions as well. So I hope that that's helpful to kind of give a little starting point to what do we do about this? If you are someone who recognizes yourself as being more on the passive side, if someone has strong opinions with this, how do you soothe yourself? Because that's going to activate your threat system. That's going to make you feel really triggered. And some of your defensive strategies will be activated, like fight, flight, freeze, and appease. Probably more likely that you either freeze, do nothing, or you appease them by submitting to their opinion. The people who are on the aggressive side might come lots into their fight system, that they just argue back and then go on and on and on. And that's the kind of stuff we see on the internet. That's even coming into stuff that I've seen from my peers, psychologists and therapists who've been speaking about this in the last few months, who've been even receiving death threats because people are fighting so much. So we don't want any keyboard warriors here. I hope that that's helpful as just kind of introduction to how we can think about this. And the last point I wanted to make is, how can you also be compassionate and kind to yourself for how hard it is in the climate around you at the moment? There is a lot of dysregulation. There's a lot of strong content, visual content all around us. And then we have people who are scared, maybe in your workplace, maybe people you see on the internet. It's very understandable that lots of us go into a freeze state and don't dare to take any action at all. It's a very common human emotion or reaction to human emotion. So be kind to yourself if you feel like I should be doing more and you just don't really know what to say and don't know what to do. So I'm going to pass that back to you, Nikita, and anyone who has any questions later on, of course.
Fantastic, Michaela. Thank you so much. So it is about being assertive. I like that kind of the middle ground. So yeah. So now, because you rarely get an opportunity to do so, when you can get to introduce two therapists back to back, because why not? I'm very happy to introduce Jonathan. So Jonathan, what are your thoughts and a little bit about yourself as well?
Hi, my name's John. I'm also a clinical psychologist. Two therapists in the room today, this me talking here this really comes off the back of conversations that I've been having, particularly with Alon around, who's also on the call, who you'll be listening to talking. Both of us who have been very, very distressed, as are many people, I imagine, by what's been going on since the 7th of October. But I think the more that we engage, the more we talk to other people, the more you begin to understand that this is not a unique experience, and it's not a unique emotional experience. This is an experience that many people go through repetitively again and again and again. And also the cycles of hate and violence that we're seeing now are also not necessarily unique as well. They're cycles that we see again and again and again. And so I think it's been very important to try as much as possible, even though I have strong feelings, to attempt, as also maybe as a therapist, but also as an individual, responsible individual in the community, to try to step back a little bit from these raised emotions, from all these strong feelings, all this hate, to try to get a sense and to understand from a contextualized perspective what's going on, and seeing this more as a cycle that we see so often. I suppose this leads me also to thinking about, because I am also involved in talking about how to support people in the workplace and also how to support individuals, what kind of impact it's having, what kind of impact does this hate have in the workplace? Does this hate speech have, do these polarized opinions have and what and it puts a lens again maybe on what workplaces should be doing, if they should be doing anything, and the impact that it has on workplaces as well, where there are strong polarized opinions. What I think it's helped me to think about is to start exploring and looking at what policies and mechanisms are already in place in organizations, to try to think about what happens when these sorts of events, when these sorts of behaviors start to emerge in organizations. So it's been interesting, really, for me as a starting point, to start looking at the different literature that's already out there, in terms of work that's done around policies for managing polarized opinions in the workplace. I happen to be very involved at the moment in working on trauma-informed practice projects in the government, and it's been quite an interesting opener that even though maybe trauma-informed practice officially comes from maybe a very different standpoint, where it's predominantly evolved from a basis of looking at the childhood traumas and the effects and impacts it's maybe having on people in relation to their behaviours, say in schools or in prison environments. What I'm been understanding is that there is a lot around that construct of trauma-informed practice, that also seems to could be extremely helpful in terms of guiding organisations now as well, and that's an area I think that's not really being married up yet. Trauma-informed practice has strong values around embedding values around safety, choice, collaboration, trustworthiness, and empowerment in an organisation. All of those, and maybe I would add to that understanding alongside what Michaela was saying in terms of compassion. I think all of those, if you're working towards embedding those kind of values in your workplace, then you're already creating an atmosphere, a culture where some of these conversations that we're talking about, managing these emotions, are going to be made much more explicit and easier to think through afterwards. That's all I'm going to say for now.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Absolutely. Especially the concept of trauma-informed. And the fact is that though right now everything feels very salient and very new, but people have been fighting each other, traumatizing each other for eons. And just being aware of that can maybe put things into perspective as well. But I'm very happy that the government is looking to trauma-informed practice. So wish you the very best with that project, which must be a test of resilience in itself. Perfect. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Alon, who identifies as a business psychologist and leadership development expert. So Alon, over to you. What are your thoughts?
Hi, and thank you very much, everyone. And I'll introduce myself, but first, also in regards to this conversation, I'll start by saying you're all invited to open cameras and microphones throughout. I think it's less about what we can bring to the table and more about an open discussion. Personally, I'm first of all, a disclaimer, I'm an Israeli. I've been living in London for the last 6 years, which the last couple of months basically gave this unique perspective of what the hell is going on and why everyone feels so desperately need to take an opinion in a complex situation. And because most of my work is focused on the organizational lens and working with leaders about liminal space and space for transformation, a lot of the question I'm seeing is how do you allow these extreme opinions to just meet somewhere and have people to have discussion and leave the social sphere, the social media sphere, and come and meet in person. And I think I have been talking to Jonathan a lot recently about how do we create a space to support organizations, because there are tensions. And I think part of this conversation that we are hoping to have today is also capture your view, the people here, about how they perceive it in their own personal level or on the organizational level, and then see, are there things that, or pillars that we can take and use and embed in organization, or kind of things. And I like what Michaela said about compassion and what Jonathan said about being informed and being very aware to the surrounding, just to allow us a different type of conversation. I think that's pretty much it. I can explain more, Nikita. I don't think there's need. I'm very much curious about seeing how this conversation will go and hearing more of the people here. I would say, you know, I'm involved a lot in project. Currently, I'm starting a project to support kids with trauma from Palestine and Israel. I think this issue is not only about this conflict, but generally, I think there's a rise in tense discussions in organizations. And thinking about it, we still need to deliver the work. And I'm thinking about the assumptions that drives us as a group working together towards something. And that's mainly the main reason that I'm trying to bring to this conversation and hear from you guys as well. So thank you very much. And I'm looking forward to the next hour together.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I can't wait to hear more about the project you have running to help kids from both sides of the conflict. And then we'll kick off with a discussion. So, Niall, over to you and your rich experience of HR and union negotiations as you transition to the world of psychology.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Nikita. My background has been primarily in HR, but I'm, as Nikita said, transitioning to become a psychologist. I think I'm interested in this conversation very much like Alon. I'm interested to hear what other people's thoughts on this are. Clearly, there are a number of conflicts going on at the minute that are quite salient and that bring this polarized opinion issue to the fore. I guess as well as working in a unionized environment, I guess I've got some experience from working in organizations that have been affected by the polarized opinions that existed in my home, or my original home of Northern Ireland. So that is something Alon mentioned, how organizations deal with this. And in somewhere like Northern Ireland, you have a legislative framework that provides some focus for that, but you've also got policies within organizations. I don't really know what the answer is in terms of the degree to which we can make policy that avoids these issues. I think you're relying much more on I think Jonathan mentioned the values within an organization, and I think that and the behaviors that you expect from individuals are important. I've been looking over some of this stuff, and very often you see references made to, a kind of an imperative on organizations to create a neutral environment. I'm not sure that's either possible or desirable. I think a harmonious environment is something which is much more a kind of a direction to try and head in. You need to let people be who they are, but also make sure that relationships are safe and respectful within the organization. And again, like I think nearly everybody has mentioned, we are living in a world where opinions get so polarized. The bête noire of social media can just cause people to feel that they have to have an opinion on something, and they need to hold that opinion firmly and almost violently on occasions. So yeah, I'm interested to hear from other people, and looks like it's going to be an interesting discussion.
Absolutely. Basically, social media put confirmation bias on steroids, as well as Google.
Absolutely.
And so many people with strongest opinions says, what is it? I do my own research, right? It's a fantastic correlation between how confident people feel about their opinion and how informed are they. It's an absolutely fascinating new space we live in. So considering on this note of the brave new world, good people, over to you. What sort of questions do you have for our speakers? What would you like to discuss today? Just feel free to unmute and jump in. Mm-hmm.
Hi, Nikita. Hi, everyone. This is Sunita here. Hi, since we've been talking about opinions and communication, and since we touched a little bit about social media, there's been one question that's been nagging me for the last couple of weeks. I hear a lot of noise on social media saying leaders should actually have an opinion about what's happening in the world. A good leader is one who shares their opinion about what's happening around. So my question is it really necessary that a leader, or any individual for that matter, first have to have an opinion about what's happening in the world, either in their part of the world or in general around the globe? And second is it necessary, if you have an opinion, that you have to really share it, especially on social media, for everybody to know where you stand? I'm seeing a lot of noise, and a lot of good friends and ex-colleagues who I never thought would take a stance on certain things have suddenly started taking stances a lot more. So that's what is driving this question.
Excellent questions, Vanessa. So even the pressure to have an opinion, so you can't get away with a strong opinion. Fascinating. And especially as leadership is the multi-layeredness of it. So who'd like to take this one? Go on, Alan. I
think it's a discussion, about polarizing opinion, and we're all trying to be too nice. So please, Niall, Jonathan, Michaela, don't hesitate, or anyone else here. I think
you can share an observation if you don't have an opinion. I'm absolutely fine.
Yeah. So I think you kind of gave the answer yourself, Sunita, about sharing an observation. I think eventually there's a situation that everyone. I see leaders struggling between the need in our senator, and I'm just reading a great book about the age of insecurity and the role of leaders in providing some sort of sense. Now, that said, and part of, for example, what Nikita has allowed us to do here today is how do we facilitate even a place for a discussion with or without saying our opinion. And also, when saying an opinion, there's also a way to say it. I mean, eventually, there's something about acknowledging the complexity of a situation. Even if it's uncertain, even if it's complex, there's a way to kind of think about what we can do. That said, I do think leaders have the pressure, definitely, to come and say something. I think it's coming, and I think they're feeling it, and I think they feel, even if I met a colleague or a client actually for a meeting, and he said, I'm really sorry about whatever happening, but I don't really have an opinion. And I actually really value that stand of view. As long as he come up front and say, hey, it's still something that we need to acknowledge. There's anyone else? I mean, Niall, do you want to continue it? Or...
I think you're exactly right. I think that fits in with that idea that I was interested in, which is that it may be difficult for people to be neutral, but being inquisitive and empathetic can make a big difference. And if your goal is harmony, which sounds rather motherhood and apple pie, then that might help with those conversations. But I think, Sunita, you, as Alon said, you got it exactly right. Having observations rather than opinions is a good start.
Well, absolutely, and I'm just quite curious about the more close quarter nature of it. So, Michaela, in your couples counseling, do you sometimes feel that one spouse pressures the other one to have a strong opinion, like, I feel strongly about this, come on, back me up on this kind of situation?
Well, absolutely. And that's where we often see a withdraw and demand pattern, or sometimes called push and pull, that when one person is in their kind of threat system where they demand, as in they might be in the kind of in a fight state, the other person might then feel quite overwhelmed and start to pull away. They start to withdraw. And with couples, you can even see one person following the other person into a different room, saying, just answer me, say something. And if you see the equivalent on social media or over emails in the workplace or wherever it might be, noticing that withdraw and demand pattern is a really common pattern of conflict. And having an observation around that, saying, actually, I feel like quite pressurized for an answer. I don't feel comfortable with this, or give me some thinking time. Usually there's a negotiation or a communication around that, around your needs, is really important. So if someone is pushing for an answer from you and you feel overwhelmed, and then you might have then gone into a kind of a flight state. You might have been quite overwhelmed by the request. So buying yourself time is always helpful, because that can give you a chance to regulate yourself somewhere else, kind of breathing, soothing yourself in. Actually, I do want to respond to this, but at the moment I feel a bit overwhelmed by the complexity of this. Can I get back to you? And also, nobody, you don't owe anyone a response to these complex discussions if you feel that that's not something you want to talk about. But as Alon was talking, and Niall as well, I was thinking about the work around empathy by Browne and Browne. When Browne also talks about how in order for us to have empathy for another person, we need to feel what they're feeling. And that sort of putting yourself in their shoes, not just logically, not just theoretically, intellectually, but emotionally. And that's why it's really difficult to sometimes extend empathy to other people who are suffering because they're having a hard time, they're feeling pain. And in order for me to empathize with you, I have to feel your pain. This is why compassion work also requires a lot of courage and a lot of strength, because to sit there and feel the pain of others, it's hard work. So I think just understanding that even as leaders, you can say, well, I don't really know what to say right now. I don't think there's anything I can say that takes your pain away. I'm just so glad you told me. I'm glad you shared this so I can hear how it is for you. Again, we can bring in that sense that, I don't think that it's going to be helpful to get into what's the right side, what is the right answer, but actually we're both in pain. You're in pain or I'm in pain, etc. If you're coming from polarized opinion, nobody's winning in those conflicts. And I think just stating that, I find that with couples, and I find that when I look at workplace conflict, to just state that as an observation that in conflict, there's rarely anyone winning in a way that there's no pain involved on either side. And we know that there's a lot of pain and suffering in innocent lives here as well. So I think if we remind ourselves of that, guided by a value system, most people can then say, oh, actually, there is a lot of pain on both sides. So that's kind of what I'm guided by, that thinking of how hard it is to be compassionate and empathetic with someone else if I don't take the time to really connect with how they are feeling.
Wonderful. Thank you. Would anybody else like to jump in to the next question or point or expand on what has been said before? Yes, Jonathan.
Yeah, just something else to add to everything else we've been saying about this. I'm talking maybe from my experience more as a therapist than a leader, because essentially that's my background. So more understand that space more and that mechanism more. But I think often I think when I'm listening to people, I do have an opinion, and it might be different to the one that the person's talking to me about. And I think I always need to make a judgment call in my head. First of all, I need to acknowledge to myself that I have an opinion that's different. And that in itself sometimes requires quite a mental leap or an acknowledgement to yourself that you're not agreeing with someone or that you think differently to them. I think that's very important sometimes that you acknowledge that to yourself, first of all, quietly, and mull over that. And then for me, it's essentially, I know that to some extent that for better or for worse, that to some extent is going to bias how I respond and how I listen. And therefore, I need to acknowledge that in terms of how I'm listening and trying to empathize as well. Sometimes I think it's useful to state your opinion in that situation and to name it for the person that you're talking to, because it helps to ground the conversation that you're having and to ground how empathic you can be, I suppose. I think at other times it's extremely important that you're labeling it for yourself and you're acknowledging that for yourself. But sometimes I think it's you have to make a judgment call whether it actually needs to be communicated to the other person while you're trying to empathize with them.
Thank you.
And on such a wonderful note, I will leave you in Jonathan's hands. Otherwise, with my more domineering side, I will probably dominate the conversation rather than let the people speak. So, Jonathan, over to you to facilitate the chat. Who'd like to go next?
Thanks,
I would like to continue, and also we can hand over to Alexandra. I see your hand is raising, so please just say if you want to speak. That's great. There's something about, I think, acknowledging our roles in this situation. There's something that, again, maybe I'm a bit over the line, but it is a very, very complex situation now in the world that is taking a lot of noise. Yeah. And that's it. It's here, and it's complex, and it's terrible for many, many reasons. specifically what's going on in the Middle East is taking a lot of attention, and from acknowledging it, and exactly as Jonathan and Michaela said, both of them of kind of understanding our personal position and our role as well in the organizational context. Am I a leader? Am I a team who looking at me as subordinates? I need to kind of understand and take it from there. And I think that's exactly the balance between our self-look and to acknowledging that there is something in the situation here. And as Jonathan said, acknowledging our role in it as well. Alexandra?
Yeah, thank you so much, Alon. I actually have a question that goes back to the beginning of the conversation. Mikhail, you were mentioning about being assertive, which stands in between passive and aggressive. And I worked in the corporate world where the word assertive is used a lot. And I think empathy, assertive, it's just sometimes misused even in different senses. And being assertive, especially in office, means being more aggressive, actually. But with a calm tone. So how would you define to be assertive, right? And what it means actually?
Do you want me to answer that one? As I was speaking about that earlier, I completely agree that assertiveness can be used synonymously with aggression and is not intended to. That's not really what I think of assertiveness as. That's why I often call it compassionate assertiveness. So if you think of it almost like a seesaw, where you're kind of balancing of needs, the passive obviously doesn't bring in your own needs into that consideration. It's just looking at the needs of others. And the aggressive is not looking at the needs of others, it's looking at the needs of yourself and prioritizing that only. And there are obviously challenges and unintended consequences to both of those. To me, assertiveness means you balancing in both sides. So you're balancing in your needs as well as the other party's needs and thinking about reaching for compromise, right? So the aggressive side might want to be winning. The passive side might be sacrificing. And there are costs to both of that. So bowling over someone or bullying someone to win, there's obviously consequences of that. You're hurting people's feelings. The consequences of being completely passive and submitting to other people's opinion is that you're hurting your own feelings. Compassionately assertive in the middle means that I'm balancing in my needs with self-compassion, thinking about how is this going to hurt me or support me, and then thinking about the other person as well. So I think a phrase that's quite helpful is to say, how can I be helpful rather than harmful right now? And that's including yourself as well as other people. So when you're assertive, I think of that as being concise and clear, speaking clearly about what it is that you want and need, and really opening your ears to listen to what is it the other person needs as well. So clarity is one of the three parts of compassion: clarity, care and commitment, and the courage to do hard things. So that's including the courage to listen to someone else's side, even when you disagree. How can you find a compromise when you feel that there is actually, there's weight to both sides of the argument? Is there a compromise? Is there a way to not come into self-sacrifice? I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you. Especially stood out for me the courage part of it.
Anyone else want to add in something on the assertiveness part?
I think if not, I mean, we can open it to more questions, or even something, maybe the people on the conversation can introduce themselves, and then we can see where you're coming from and why even and joining this conversation. I think there's something about just sharing as Alexandra and Sunita has done earlier, just basically your personal interest. And I think is a starting point to this conversation. I think that's eventually this is a topic that touches a lot of us in a different sense. So if I'm sending an open invite, if you want to start and introduce yourself and why you're here, basically, in a sense.
I'll jump in, seeing as everybody's very, very quiet. You can see me in my Christmas jumper. Afternoon, everybody. Obviously, all very shy on this. So my interest is my background's in culture and engagement, and And part of my work seeks to actively create some discourse so friendly friction, positive friction within organizations to help stimulate kind of innovative discussions and so on. So what's attracted me to this is, apart from you're all experts in your own right, is actually how do you make sure that those conversations don't become too emotive and don't become too much friction, so they're actually disruptive. So basically, how do you combat groupthink? That's the quick and dirty version of it.
It's a very good question. Yeah,
I think
Niall.
I know Nikita asked me to speak earlier to say what I wanted to get out of it, but I think I've been quite stimulated by the idea that we spoke around leaders. Do they need to take an opinion? And I remember working for an organization that tried to stay neutral on everything, and I think that affected people's perception. Like, it was almost, they were neutral to the point where it was like, well, you obviously have an opinion and now you're just concealing it, and it feels not duplicitous, but I think it eroded the trust in the leadership, where everything was just like, hey, this is Smiles, everything was very and the default position on everything was I don't know, like, I think DEI conversations can be quite I think there's a lot of people with opinions in organizations who are scared to share them for fear of being called like a bigot or something like that. Or we are scared of having like robust conversations around what aspects of DEI work, what aspects of DEI don't work, and how do we do it better? How do we make sure that more people are involved? And I think that's a great example of where conversations can get very emotive for various reasons, and we don't necessarily have environments, or we're not necessarily creating environments for that kind of discussion. It's more like, get on board with what the company says, or shut up, basically. So yeah, I think that idea of being able to disagree in a functional way and create space for each other, I've not really heard it spoken about before.
Thank you, Grant.
I guess the work that I've done has touched on the DEI space for quite some time, and I think I can hear what you're saying about this idea that people are in some ways very, very guarded, and this idea of a neutral environment where everything is, people's opinions and views on these things are hidden can be damaging. But it's a real, like all these things, it's a very complex problem, because I don't think I want to work in an environment where people are expressing what I might regard as hate speech, and that's not a psychologically safe place. But where people are completely hiding opinions which might not necessarily be, legitimately regarded as offensive to somebody else, but feel that they can't express themselves. The sense that I've got in the time that I've been working around these things is that people have become much more reticent in expressing things, as you said, for fear of being accused of bigotry. But the flip side is that they are much more sensitive. It's a complicated balancing act that I'm not sure what the answer is to.
Yeah, that's exactly my experience as well, Niall. In a way, I've worked for organizations that are massive and that want to stay neutral on all topics. And it's understandable, because it's so easy to take a stance, even if it's a very mild one, and still offend people, because there's a huge number of people around. So there's people of all walks of life there, and you don't want to offend, you don't want to alienate. And at the same time, I worked for organizations that did take a stance, and it felt a bit like, can't I have my own opinion? So where's that balance? How do you get that sweet spot? I think everybody's searching for that. I don't think there's a specific answer that will solve it for all. It's yeah. balancing act. But I really like what you said earlier, where you're like, we should move away from neutrality, but find harmony instead, to define that rather than just be void of any opinions.
I wonder if I can kind of bring in something that's sometimes used in dialectical behavior therapy, which is a therapy form that was developed for helping people with very strong emotional dysregulation, even to the point where it would break down relationships or struggle with interpersonal effectiveness or even suicidal ideation. So the level of kind of understanding emotion dysregulation in DBT is to help people validate their own feelings. But you can validate an emotion, you can validate an experience and add an and to it. So this might look something like a completely, based on what Frankie's saying in the chat window, of letting people explode and let them cool to feel that they've been heard. So letting someone know that they've been heard is a way of validating them. So that's validating them as this is your truth. So you can validate that someone feels a certain way, thinks a certain way, and add an and, which is sort of the dialectical thinking around it. So I completely see that this makes you feel very upset, or I completely understand where your anger is coming from. And it's really important to be respectful to other people in the workplace. So the and bit is the dialectics. It's not, you can validate someone's emotions and at the same time make a request for what you need from them or how you need them to behave in a context where it also affects other people. So I love this technique because it's the deepest form of empathetic validation is to say, yes, I see you, you are okay as you are, and I need you to be doing more. That's really, really challenging. We see it between couples, we see it in people who are very, very dysregulated. And again, so coming back to empathy, that it's really hard to do this if you don't agree with why they're angry, or you agree with why they're having this strong emotion. So I see why you needed to explode and needed a moment to cool it off, etc. And it's really important that we don't say stuff in the heat of the moment that will hurt other people in the workplace. So do you see that just the magic of the word and, but do the validation first. Often we come into the don't be like that in the workplace, or don't do this thing. And that is just going to fall flat if you don't do the validation bit first. You can't put your request out to someone if you're not validated their feeling first. Otherwise, they will just ramp up. It's like turning the volume up on a stereo, but validation can make them kind of go, I have been heard. Okay, you get why I was so emotional about this. So it's a useful technique to think about both in the workplace and with anyone.
I agree, and I think there's also a question. It's also raised a question. I mean, the organizational role eventually has a very obvious task that got nothing to do with the diversion and inclusivity. And there's a conversation started in the chat, which is really interesting, about how much do we force people to be inclusive? How much do we try to hear everything? Disclaimer, I don't know the answer. I think it's really interesting. How do you find balance? That there's a word that keep on coming in this conversation, even in what you said, Michaela. How do you find balance between holding a space that allows difficult conversation, but still, because people need a place to express themselves, and organizations are a container for our life, basically, in a sense. And then, on the other hand, the organization has its own goal and all challenges to achieve from a very practical level of the bottom line and uncertainty in life. And I think that's balance is a tricky thing to grasp. I mean, personally, I think I have a thought, but I'm curious. What do you think? I mean, guys, and I see Danny and Frankie and Jurian. I hope I say your name right, but it's really interesting. Yeah.
Can I ask a controversial question? Because do we actually need to express our opinions at the workplace? Because the workplace is a very structured environment, right? And companies need to adhere to the law, right? And sometimes it's even safe for individuals to be blended in the environment without opinions, just to do the work from 9 to 5 and have their opinions outside. So,
very good question, Alexandra.
I guess to build on that a little bit, the work that's done in Northern Ireland around there's a concept called an emblem. So when many years ago, when workplaces were much more divided along sectarian grounds, there would be clear emblems of one community or the other on display in factories, and that could make a very hostile environment, and therefore serve not to promote inclusion. So that's somebody expressing an opinion, but it then goes into much more gentle things. The subtlety of wearing a crucifix cross could be a way in which somebody expresses their identity and therefore perhaps expresses or is perceived to express an opinion. Wearing a poppy, wearing a shamrock on St. Patrick's Day, and those things which person A might do, feeling I'm just expressing my cultural identity in a gentle and respectful way, can be perceived by somebody as disrespectful. And the flip side of that is somebody can almost aggressively do something which isn't that aggressive, but their intent is different, and it's a real challenge. I think not expressing an opinion sometimes isn't an option, and you've got to get ready to deal with where an opinion is expressed, even if it's done gently.
If I may, I think
whether that's relevant,
whether you overtly express the opinion or not, you express the opinion. It will come across through other ways, decisions that are made, the culture that's created, and I'm not sure what the answer is, but certainly my view is that yes, you can go through the perfunctory, rudimental, everybody just fit in, keep your opinions to yourself type mode, and you will get a level of performance and a level of compliance in your organization. But high-performing teams and high-performing organizations run on discretionary effort, and discretionary effort is given on the basis of vulnerability and not having to hide or wear a persona that masks who you are in some of your opinions. But it also comes from a place of respect that some of my opinions might be at a polar opposite of where you are, but we've got far more in common than we do that kind of doesn't suit. And just to pick on Niall's point, I've worked in Belfast, and even though those visible symbols might be taken away, even things as simple as surnames, we will spot we'll spot the differences between our tribes, and that can be a cause of friction if we don't manage the inclusivity of the workplace.
Yeah, I do think there are certain topics that would cause more friction, and it's more difficult to find like a harmonious way of dealing about it. A personal example where, sorry, I'll give the example just now. What I wanted to say is that everybody should take a bit of agency as well, because I think we're putting too much emphasis on leaders, organizations to do the right thing. And as soon as they do something that might slightly offend, let's not go for the big topics, but for small things, people feel really offended and really, I don't know, I have this knee-jerk reaction about it. Isn't that a little bit about them, on them, that they are having such a strong response to something that doesn't necessarily need a strong response? And that's where I want to give my example. My leader sent an email the day after the Queen had passed away to say, oh, this is a really tough time, and she was very compassionate in a way. I'm not from the UK. I didn't feel it that way at all. And my first response was like, oh, that's a bit over the top. And I'm like, okay, hang on. No, for her, this is a very strong emotion. Let me shut up and not say that, and just let it be and let it sit out there. But it was interesting that first thought in my head, like, oh wow, this is a bit much. It's like you can never do it right. So the people who get the messages, the employees, every individual has a sense of responsibility to stay in the harmonious. I think that's what I'm trying to say.
I think I would really add in, and I would say that maybe to what you said, Jerry, and I think it's also the context and the cultural backgrounds that we really come from that's important. What kind of cultural backgrounds do we really come from? And when we communicate something, are we contextualizing that to say that, hey, this is why this thought process or opinion is coming your way, or this is why a certain thought process is being expressed? I think that has been a key thing that I have seen missing in many of the communications, where the disjoint feeling or the feeling of not being connected really comes in. And also the fact that not everybody culturally is really close to what is really happening. And maybe that is where the polarization sometimes does not make sense. At least to me, it doesn't make sense when someone was talking about DEIB kind of conversations in organizations. Many a times the lens is, at least for, if I can speak for myself, I'm from India, and many a times the concepts and the lens of looking at DEIB is from the US or is from Europe, where India is culturally a very different place. And for us, DIEB has been, or at least D and E and I has been there for a very long time in very different contexts. So I think, so for us, diversity is like, what are you talking about diversity? We thrive, we live, we struggle in that every single day. But then the contextualization sometimes is missing, and the cultural aspect or the cultural nuances are not being sensitive about. That's something that I'd like to add to what Darian said.
I agree. I agree with you both. I think it's fascinating. And going back to what Alexandra said, I don't think no one needs to voice. There's no need to voice your opinion. But it became very evident in the last couple of months that people fearing not to voice, or because the identity is being part of an organization is such a big part of our identity, and something is happening, we feel the urge to bring it to the workplace. I think there's somebody that came in a chat about how do we allow this conversation to happen, and I think the how is a really good question. And it came across this conversation a lot of time between what Michaela said about taking from couple therapy to Niall, and just allowing even the sublime way of communicating this sort of stuff. But how do we, and going back to our roles as well, as if we're leaders or if we're part of a team, how do we allow other voices to be heard, even if they're very different than ourselves? Yeah, or even if they are very polarizing in a sense. And I think the how is a good, even having it in top of mind, I think it could help in a sense when approaching that. There are things that we need to think about. How do we allow these different voices to be heard or not, which is also okay, and I think also worth thinking about.
It's a thought, Alon, and that's been sparked by what you've just said, which is that where we live in a world where people within an organization hold different views within that, or come from a culture which would point them in a particular direction on those views, that there's also a shared belonging to an organization. And whether I don't have an opinion on this, but it's a question that the degree to which we can leverage the commonality of working in the same organization to help people have positive conversation. Not 100% sure where that's taking me, but it reminded me that that's one of the things that people have in common.
Jonathan, you're mute.
I couldn't hear anything there, Jonathan.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. No, I was just wondering. You mentioned that you were present and maybe working in HR in Northern Ireland. So is that right?
Yeah. So I've actually worked in Northern Ireland, but I don't live there anymore.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I was just wondering. Like we've been talking a lot in terms of the nuances and the problems. I thought maybe it would be useful as well to try to hone in a little bit on some things that feel a bit more practical as well, that we can think about in terms of that might be a big ask for everyone here, but I think maybe if there are any things that you can remember or think of that felt that were good interventions or good proactive approaches that you think were helpful for this kind of situation you're talking about.
I'm not sure how knowledgeable. I'll kind of try my best. We had in Northern Ireland, we had sort of equality legislation well before the rest of the United Kingdom, because we had this very clearly defined tribal sectarian difference between us. And I think the value of it is that it acknowledged something that I think Danny referenced, which is that Northern Irish people will signal the community to which they belong actively or passively in terms of their name. I'm from a mongrel background, so my names are quite confusing for people. But even some interesting work done at the psychology department in Queen's, where people could almost tell from other people's faces without any clothing cues. We really were that invested in bigotry. So there are laws that prevent, there are policies and laws that you can work on. What's interesting is reading what organizations are doing now is going beyond that. And as I said earlier, talking about that harmonious way of working. My experience was that I ended up working in Scotland for 20 years. I worked on a couple of occasions with organizations, practically with organizations who were based in Northern Ireland. There would have been assumptions made about my background, but I went over after 20 years of these sort of this legislation being in place and found a very changed place. And so that makes me think that time is one of the big practical things, which is not necessarily available to everybody. But I would be going into organizations which had been overtly of one community, who would have assumed that I was from the other community and found nothing but respect. And that wouldn't have been the case 20 years previously. I'm not sure how helpful that is to anybody. But allowing in those contexts, I knew who people were able to express who they were. They were from a loyalist or a Republican or a nationalist or a Catholic, or I knew who they were, and we valued each other for what we could bring to work. And sometimes even a little bit of humor can creep into these things as well. But that needs to be done with a degree of subtlety and decency. But I guess the other practical thing, and again, I've seen this in Scotland, where sectarianism is also rife, is that organizations do need to be ready to address problems where they arise and to take action where somebody oversteps the boundary, and you can try to be understanding, but actually ensuring that people understand that there are codes of behavior that they need to adhere to, and that there are consequences for not holding to the codes of behavior is really important. And in industrial settings, I've seen people lose their job for behavior that was entirely unacceptable. I guess that's my thoughts on that.
I mean, I would like to follow up on, again, I think there's something about boundaries that are really important. Yeah. And especially the roles for leaders to acknowledge the situation and set some boundaries from this understanding that it's a complex situation, even to get people to feel a bit more safe in expressing or what they can or cannot express, which can be challenging, and I think in a sense, but I think there's a lot about boundaries, and then within these boundaries do allow a conversation, do allow different emotions to come, as long as you because some voices aren't, and I think you're absolutely right, it's been 20 years, but these things are still, the challenges are almost the same challenges in terms of coming and bringing your identity to the workplace. I think it's only, in a sense, only became worse because the whole social media sphere kind of get the notions of identity so much more, we all became our own separate identity and continent in a sense. And then you need to kind of bridge it in a workplace that is group context in a sense.
I'm a big lover of ambiguity. There should be more ambiguousness everywhere.
Yeah. That's the solution. Yeah. Frank, yes, you've written something you want to explain it? Can we hear you and explain it a bit more about what you said about the unacceptable?
Okay, I'll take myself off mute, but tell me if it's too noisy. So some people, and I know this is definitely a cultural divide, are very direct. And so, for example, in France, clients of mine have actually said that you don't praise others in public. You would criticize others in public, and you would praise in private. Now, you can't do that in the UK. It would be considered as bad management. Now, if you take that behavior over here, it would be considered as bullying. Now, also, there are cultures where they're more direct. Eastern European cultures are more direct. And some people over here, for example, if you have an Anglo-Saxon culture, they would actually feel that that is, it is too assertive, or they've been, other people are being rude or invasive or bullying, or and whether that, but in another person's world they're just being assertive. Do you see what I mean, Alon? Yeah. And it's about how we, I mean, and I get brought into companies where I have to sort of bring them together and make them understand each other's communication style, and then how to phrase it so that you're modifying, but you can't modify all the time because you don't always know who you're dealing with, because it's also down to personality.
I think you're right, Frankie. I think though in a lot of circumstances, people are quite adept at recognizing those cultural differences within organizations. I've worked in places where, you know, it's been a partially European, partially Chinese leadership, and I just had to get used to being called fat. But you know, that more direct form of conversation, I recognize, you know, I think most people would, the cultural differences.
I think there might be more subtle ways as well. I mean, I've heard about people who, for example, let's just say it's the same culture, and they say that they're being bullied by their manager. But the manager simply wants the other person to challenge them. So they're prodding them all the time to challenge them. And they're getting frustrated because they're not being challenged. And that would just be one way, one reason why somebody's acting the way they do. I mean, there's lots of other things, but lots of other motivators behind being very perpetually direct, let's say. But I wouldn't automatically, when people tell me about they're being bullied at work, I want to know exactly what's going on, because it's such a loaded term. And it is to do with culture, but it's also to do with personality, which is less, you know, it really does take conversations to understand what's going on underneath.
I note that question. When I mentioned unacceptable behaviour, I've got to admit what was going through my head was two people knocking lumps out of each other on a factory floor, which is unambiguous in terms of its unacceptability. But you're right, it requires skilled management to kind of work out what is acceptable and unacceptable when they're applying policies.
Yeah, I agree. Smacking each other in the face is probably unacceptable at work.
Probably.
Yeah, that's a boundary.
Depends on your workplace, yeah. If you're a professional fighter, you know, you can never know if you're. But I think, and then you wrote something about the culture, and you're absolutely right. If the organization is aware of its culture, and not of you know, something that is said on the wall, you know, if the organization is saying, yeah, we're very diverse and open, but actually there isn't a sublime culture of allowing that, that's a challenging point. And Frankie, you're right. You're all right. I mean, in this communication and holding these different thoughts.
While we're talking here, I'm keep reminded, I don't know how helpful it is, of the recent, for those of you in the UK, where there was a strong drive for pro-Palestinian groups to march in London. And it actually caused a very obvious divide in terms of leadership, a very open divide right in front of us, at the very top, in terms of some people feeling that people shouldn't be expressing their opinion, and others being guided by looking at the values of the law, looking at the law, legislation, and the values of their organisation, the Met Police, and making an informed decision to allow that march to go ahead, with certain caveats in place, and in being very specific about what bullying looked like, what racism looked like, and trying to make it clear and very clear, even by distributing flyers, about what was acceptable and unacceptable behaviour. I think that was a really nice example right in the public sphere as to the difficulties and nuances that we see leaders going through and the decisions they have to make.
And it's also a good example of how they communicated it, almost as something that previously probably won't be communicated, and now they kind of the need to say, this is our approach, this is what we've done, and how we're going to take about it. Which didn't help with people, saying that's the wrong thing to do, but still is important in a sense.
Yeah, I think building on that, I feel that the police almost managed to maintain the moral high ground by not being neutral, but by being, respectful to a range of opinions.
If I can just add Sorry, Frankie. I was going to say, if I can just add another example to bring it back to work as well. One of the things that the police do really well is when the arrests are made for people that don't behave congruently with the expectations of what's on the flyers, etc., the accusation is made about the person's behavior, not about the person. So we delineate the two apart. And I think one of the challenges in business is often people aren't coached on how to give that sort of feedback and challenge the behaviors, and it becomes, you are bad because you did this thing, rather than your behavior at that time was unacceptable, but that doesn't define you as an individual. It makes people defensive. It makes it a more emotive conversation. Great example, Jonathan. I like that.
If you go back to the marches, actually, what it's making me realise is about something, referring to something that somebody said earlier about leadership, and you don't hear them drawing out boundaries of acceptable and unacceptable behaviour. So it's not clear, which is why certain supporters are indulging in, assaults, for example. I mean, I know because it's happened to friends of mine. So there aren't lines being drawn. So if we take that into the workplace, I just think people, on one hand, we need more nuance, as other people have said, in debate. And on the other hand, we also need clear boundaries about what is and isn't okay.
It's one of the things that crops up when you're dealing with sort of corporate responses to things. Is a test that's often applied is the idea of what would a reasonable employer conclude about is this idea of reasonableness, and it's really hard to catalogue all the acceptable and unacceptable behaviours, but most intelligent people have an understanding of what is reasonable in terms of their behaviour, what would be reasonable to conclude was unacceptable. But it's also a challenge to to really lay down an exhaustive list of what is and isn't acceptable.
I think some cultures are much more explicit. So for us, it's easy to assume what is acceptable and unacceptable. But I don't know whether we can. I have a low expectation. I'm going to get down to it. I have a low expectation of people. It's the type of thing you just got to tell them.
Yeah. Well, if it was all that easy, they wouldn't need professionals in the people field.
It would put HR out of work.
But I think also, I mean, I mean, the low expectation is a good point, but eventually me and Jonathan wanted to start this conversation because our thought was, okay, how do we can support HR? Eventually there's acknowledging there is a situation here and organizations are playing a role in this complex situation, you know, if they would like it or not. And then going back to even SDC, I'm assuming that's not a name, but he said, I mean, finding a way of resources and a look around the work. Jonathan is, and maybe Jonathan, you can elaborate, but how can we help the organization to even approach it? And it could be, frankly, if you're coming as a consultant or if you're coming as an advisor, how can you say, hey, there's actually ways you can go about it? And because 9 times out of 10, I would assume they don't know. And not because they mean not to. I think they simply don't know, especially, and it came across now in a really complex culture environment. People are working from home, working from office, working from different cultures, different countries, different languages. And then how do you bring these together and set some boundaries or guidance? Because organizations need to do something, in a sense. Jonathan, do you want to share something from your experience about resources and things that organizations can do? And maybe that would be kind of a good way to kind of get us towards the end of this session.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've just added to the chat there, but it's just a very it's a page, but the CIPD I think have put out a very good resource, which is quite recent in terms of it's a bit responsive, but it's very much for people who need to think on their feet in terms of maybe what they should be doing in terms of leadership and guidance at this time. I think some of the takeaways from me from that was the importance of looking back at your policies, which I think we've been discussing here, and making sure that the policies in place are very clear and that the boundaries are in place. And I think often organisations, when they do look at that, maybe that's something, particularly younger organisations, that they need to be thinking about. I also found it very helpful to think about the idea that line managers play a very important role in this process as well, in terms of they're there to manage, to listen, to be empathic, to be compassionate, but also to notice as well, and to be assertive, and nip things in the bud, nip issues or conflicts as they're starting to progress in the bud, and being very proactive in that process, a bit like they're encouraged to do around well-being, for example. So I found that a really good takeaway as well. I think these are the kind of things that organisations, from a leadership point down, really need to be filtering down to their organisation and making sure that line managers are running with this and acknowledging that. I've mentioned trauma-informed practice already. I'll mention it again. It's a big space and it's a big area to sort of go through here. But I think that it's a fantastic model or theory that's informed predominantly by empathy, psychological empathy, in terms of really pushing an organisation's values and its practice towards a more empathic model from its very roots, right through the organisation, right through its fabric. And I truly believe from the work that I'm doing in this area that can have, it's a long-term work, but it can have a huge impact on the kind of the conversations that we're talking about and the kind of problems that we're seeing in organisations around polarised opinions.
Good. I think maybe we'll sum it up. Niall, if you want to say something, or Danny or anyone before we kind of sum it up, and then.
I don't think I've got much to add to it. It's been a really interesting conversation. It's sparked a lot of thoughts with me. It's been great to hear from everybody.
Has anyone else got any takeaways they'd like to add before we finish up? Clearly not.
No, I'll just say I think there's definitely what we came across about the role of HR and the boundaries and finding the balance, just acknowledging that something is going on. And then from that, taking our stance and our role as consultants or HR leaders or leaders, basically, and then finding out resources of what we can do and not ignoring the situation. I think the police example is a really good one. And thank you, everyone, for this really, really interesting conversation.
Say goodbye to everybody.
Thank you.